The Inquisition. Inquisition, a name that makes the veins and the pulse tremble. Generally one thinks of the Spanish one, but the Inquisition was born a long time before that and had been in operation all the time of Dante's life. Its, page 46, presence, as we will see, was not at all marginal in Italian cities and determined a particular climate fundamental to an understanding of Dante's work. It must be said that the sources are often distorted and the documents scarce. As Andrea del Colle, one of the greatest scholars of this topic, as regards the Middle Ages, and above all the Italian Middle Ages, writes, the documentary shipwreck is gigantic and almost nothing was saved. The minutes of the trials have almost all disappeared, perhaps destroyed. The Inquisition was instituted to combat Cathar heresy. We saw when and how. The first time the name appears is in 1184 in the decree Ad Abolendum, with which Pope Lucius III imposed on bishops to try, that is, investigate, any suspects and establish the appropriate penalties, that they should be executed by the secular authorities on pain of excommunication. It treats of an act somewhat delayed, given that the Cathars had already been condemned in the Third Lateran Council of 1179, but with a much reduced effect. Very different was the effect, still not immediate, of the decree Virgentus Insenium of 1199, with which Innocent III equated heresy to a crime of lèse-majesté, with all the legal implications, including capital punishment. They also ruled that the property of heretics should be confiscated. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, also wanted by Innocent III, solemnly confirmed such anti-heretical dictates, confiscation of goods, capital punishment, etc., and introduced a last instrument of control of conscience, the obligation on all believers to confess at least once a year. Obviously also to communicate, not by chance that the council also dealt with the establishment of the dogma of transubstantiation, but I will speak about this later. In the meantime, the crusade had begun against the Albigensians, 1209, something Innocent III had always wanted. 20 years of military attacks devastated the country, ruined the Florentine economy, but they were not able to completely eradicate all heresy. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX made a last decisive attempt. He entrusted the tribunals of the Inquisition to the Dominicans, simultaneously pressing on the bishops and the secular authorities to furnish their support. The inquisitors would be nominated by him and responsible to him. There is an obvious need, page 47, to take the reins directly into his hands for the defense of orthodoxy. As Michel Roquebert writes, Pope Gregory IX was forging the preferred instrument of all future totalitarianism. The Inquisition was the first manifestation in history of a system of absolute ideological control on an entire population by way of investigations, institutionalized condemnation, interrogations, and the creation of files of information. From such data, the number of burnings increased to a dizzying extent everywhere, in Germany, in France, and in the north-central cities of Italy. The worst was always yet to come. With the decree Ad Extirpanda, Innocent III ratified the recourse to torture that should be carried out without loss of body members or danger of death, often rendered invalid for those under Inquisition, most of whom, however, were sent to the fire. The fact is that it had to come to confession, which had a far greater probative value than the ordeal of fire and water previously practiced to demonstrate the guilt, or to be precise, the heresy. Almost certainly, torture was also practiced before that date. From then, though, the situation had to degenerate as to induce Innocent IV just 2 years later, in 1254, to the substitution of the Dominicans by the Franciscans in most centres for the Inquisition, in the hope that they would be less cruel. These, we shall see, were not so thirsty for blood as for money. Between 1256 and 1260, Pope Alexander IV granted to the inquisitors the privilege of reciprocally absolving themselves for the irregularities that they could commit in the exercise of their functions. The decree of 1252 also established the formation of a body of police for the capture of heretics and the confiscation of their property, as well as the distribution of revenue from the sale of such property in 3 parts: one to the community, one to the office of the Inquisition, one to the inquisitor or the bishop. 2/3 of confiscated goods would go in this way to ecclesiastic institutions. In the re-edition of 1265, the word bishop disappeared, and around 1330, the part due to the community disappeared of the conspicuous revenues of the sacred tribunal, because a new disposition let half of the revenues to the inquisitors, while the other half was directly assigned to the apostolic camera, that is, to the papal treasury. Page 48. It's true that in Italy there was no crusade against the Cathars. Nevertheless, the interventions of the inquisitors were often accompanied by an armed force in Italy too. In the year 30 of the 13th century, there arose indeed some armed penitential confraternities. It concerned a permanent mobilization of the laity, noble and not, under the ecclesiastical control of and in support of the actions of the Dominican inquisitors, a daily form of crusade that gained plenary indulgences in the case of death fighting for the church. The Inquisition employed judicial terminology, court, trial, judge, perhaps to confer an aura of legality and justice to their own activities. Indeed, it was a far cry from trial as we mean it today, but already from how it was envisaged in Roman law, where the judge placed himself between the litigants. In the inquisitorial trial, instead, the judge was the same inquisitor. The poor unfortunate had neither the right to a lawyer or even to introduce evidence in support of his own innocence. The trial consisted essentially in a structured interrogation in a manner to demonstrate his guilt. The fact remains that it wasn't always the wish of the inquisitors to kill. Sometimes conversion was more convenient. The infamous Inquisitor Bernard Gouy, who operated at Toulouse from 1307 to 1324, and the sinister character who was sketched with skill by Umberto Eco in The Name of the Rose, wrote, "The objective of the Inquisition consists in destroying heresy. But heresy cannot be annihilated if the heretics are not destroyed, and that can be tackled in 2 ways, with their conversion to the true Catholic faith, or when, abandoned to secular burning, their bodies are immolated. The conversion must be sincere, and the almost complete proof of this sincerity is the denunciation of their acquaintances, sometimes of their own parents. So a continual pressure was exercised on the accused to gradually entrap them in this system, within which they would gain absolution, playing the abominable game of denunciation. The solidarity of family and clan that had for such a long time constituted the force of religious resistance would, little by little, be replaced by a climate of suspicion that will break this network of solidarity from the inside. The day in which everyone distrusted everybody will not be capable of resistance any more. Page 49. As concerns the converted Cathars, a question recurring in almost all books that deal with the topic is, in summary, this: if they were converted due to fear of the fire, or were they perhaps convinced by the preaching and good example of the Dominicans and Franciscans? The historians opt, according to their ideas, for one or the other of these two hypotheses, and conclude that it is not possible to give an answer to such a question. To my mind, it concerns a question in bad faith, above all when it is posed by historians that history should be familiar with, and should know that during the whole 12th century considerable efforts were made to eradicate heresy through the preaching, while they were still then being excommunicated and burned, but all of this proved fruitless. Bernard of Clairvaux went personally to Toulouse in 1145, but his preaching mission was a total failure, despite the recourse to miracles. I healed the sick, giving them holy, blessed bread, to show and affirm the virtue of real truth, compared to the falsity of the heretics. Society had evolved in the 12th century, and there was a widespread desire for knowledge and a more profound and responsible religiosity. These tricks based on superstition, with which the teeth of sacred power were put forward again as the exclusive representation of sacred power, no longer convinced, just as the preaching of Dominic later failed. Moreover, as regards the good example, the Dominicans were known as the dogs of God. Their order is called even today the preaching friars. Preachers, whom I should call transgressors, wrote Pierre de la Vigne, who lived in those years and knew them well. It would be enough to read just a little of the literature of the time, such as the Decameron by Boccaccio, to have an idea of how little good was the example of these Franciscan friars. Or listen to what Dante says about both the two illustrious representatives of their respective orders, Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure of Bagnoregio. So, had these good examples been able to convert the Cathars? The Cathars were criminalized and demonized. About them the most wretched things had been written, and that were also absurd and blatantly false. They were defined as the devil's limbs. They were described as a sect of depraved people, devoted to obscene sexual practices. The objective of the men of the church was certainly that of sowing, page 50. Mistrust among the faithful and fear of difference. The Cathars, however, as all the sources testify, had an irreproachable moral conduct and lived in extreme coherence towards their creed. They were truly a good example. So to the question of what caused the disappearance of the Cathars, there can only be one answer: the climate of terror that the Church succeeded in creating all over Europe, in all the world of that time. And it is stupefying, as Roquebert writes, that taking into account the methods that they, the Inquisition, had at their disposal, they took so much time to get the better of Catharism. Also on this, one should ask oneself why. We would recognize immediately then another falsity that was often found in the history books. And that is that the inquisitors as monks would be very welcome among the population. This is completely untrue, and these same books that affirm it fall into contradiction when they are then required to refer to verified reports in almost all the Italian cities, and from the beginning against the Inquisition, experience everywhere, not only against the Cathars, but against the citizens of the Catholic faith, as a system of oppression. Many cities refused to include the anti-heretical laws in their statutes, and for decades opposed the entrance of the inquisitors. In this way, Venice, Verona, Treviso, Bologna, Florence, Siena, Genova, Mantova, and Rimini. Milan instead immediately welcomed the new directives, but was the protagonist of the one case in Italy of homicide against an inquisitor, that of the very much hated Peter of Verona, immediately exalted to the glory of the altars, notwithstanding the excesses of the cruelty perpetrated in the exercise of his task. Without leading to homicide, there were several occasions in which popular hostility led to attacks, storming the monasteries and clubbing the inquisitors, as at Piacenza, 1233, Orvieto, 1239, Florence, 1245, Prato between 1270 and 1279, Parma, 1279, Bologna, 1299, Novara, 1300, Milan, 1346, Susa, 1365, Bricaraccio, 1374, due in general to the greedy and hateful behaviour of some of these inquisitors. Of particular interest is the tumult that erupted in Bologna in 1299, following the condemning to death of a certain Bompietro and Giuliano. The day of the burning saw a huge revolt against the inquisitors. A good 343 people who participated were tried and, page 51, it is noteworthy that the majority were women, 257 as opposed to 98 men. On that day, it wasn't only the Cathars who were railing against and cursing the inquisitors and the monks, but Christians of every social class. Crowd yelled, swore, railed. Some said condemnations were made to subtract the money and the property of the heretics. Others because Bompietro had not given over his sister to the inquisitor. The monks were insulted as diabolical men, heretics, worst of dogs, more deserving to be burnt than Bompietro and Giuliano. A sword appeared, some threw stones, but the executions took place nonetheless. The anger of the people was enormous, protesting, however, the highest risk that was run in those times. A similar tumult burst out in 1279 in Parma, for the burning of a Cathar provoked a papal interdict for 3 years. Beyond this gratuitous cruelty, excessive zeal is the term used by the Church. The accusation most turned against the inquisitors was that which was heard resounding in the streets of Bologna, in that the condemnations were made to extract the money and property of the heretics. Unfortunately, that really was the case, as the few documents we have at our disposal testify. Theoretically, the monks of both orders were dedicated to personal poverty, but the inquisitors led a life anything but poor. Sins of every type were the order of the day, starting from the most harmless to those of greed. Often, a not insignificant amount of money that entered the official Inquisition coffers were used for the acquisition of houses and land for their own relatives and friends. The book, The Inquisition of Italy by Andrea del Colle, apart from reporting various cases of misappropriation, claims that, in the first half of the 14th century, some 50 Italian inquisitors were under investigation and tried for abuses committed in the execution of their duties, in particular concerning economic management. The same Del Colle believes that this number is high and impressive. In fact, if one reported the number of inquisitors present, it makes up almost all of them. Officially, the revenues in the offices of the Inquisition came in 3 types: fines, bail, and the sale of seized goods. There was another type, unofficial, that one of Boccaccio's short stories told about. Page 52, in which it tells about a minor friar, therefore Franciscan, inquisitor of the depraved heretic, he who, with many signs of appearing holy and holding a love for the Christian faith, as all do, was no less a good investigator of he who had a full purse than he who was weak in faith. Having found a good man, much richer in money than in wisdom, and threatening to send him to the fire for heresy, obtains the emptying of florins into his hand. But we are analysing the official means. For the confessed heretics, and who did not abjure capital punishment, and the confiscation of goods. But we are analysing the official means. For the confessed heretics and who did not abjure, capital punishment and the confiscation of goods was expected. This last was also implemented in the confrontations with those who were sentenced to prison on bread and water and chains on their feet, and some inquisitors applied it even to those who converted, but generally for a heretic who abjured and converted, other penalties were expected, among which imprisonment, public whipping, the obligation to carry the cross stitched on their clothes, these last measures previously applied by Dominic himself, or exorbitant fines and a warning beyond a guarantee of money aimed at assuring the observance of obligations to maintain the Catholic faith, of persecuting and denouncing heretics and their advocates and defenders, and executing the imposed penalties. In the case of default, detected with the judicial discretion of the inquisitor, the bail remained with the court. Whoever after abjuring showed the slightest sympathy or proffered a good word towards heresy or any heretic was considered recidivist. Returned to their own vomit was the term used by the inquisitors, and was condemned to be burned at the stake. Fines were imposed for other offences, for example for having spoken badly of the Pope or having impeded the actions of the inquisitors, and one can advance the hypothesis that these last were arbitrary and disproportionate to the fault. As exorbitant and numerous the fines could be, the majority of revenue was without doubt represented by the sale of confiscated property. Here, the greed of the inquisitors and of the Holy See itself had no limits. More often came the investigations and then the condemnations to end in confession by reason of torture. People who, just as it says in Boccaccio's short story, or the parody of Peire Cardinal cited above, one would only know that they were rich, even if they had nothing to do with heresy. As all the historians denounced, it was not necessary to be a Cathar to feel a victim of an, page 53, oppressive system that left no one in peace and lost no occasion to exert coercion of every form. There was then another practice which wasn't generally brought to light, posthumous condemnation. Starting with the end of the 13th century, such procedures became ever more frequent. They held a regular trial of the deceased person who, obviously, had absolutely no possibility of defending themselves. Condemned as a heretic, the corpse was exhumated and burned in the fire. One could object, better to burn a dead person than a live one. This true, but the problem is different. The historians generally limit themselves to condemn these condemnations as repugnant, macabre, and execrable, without dwelling on the terrible implications of such practices, and without asking themselves why these practices came to be done. It's clear they didn't serve for conversion. One reason why they were, and to my mind more deplorable than the burning of a corpse. Following the condemnation, the inquisitors had the right, in fact, to confiscate the property of the deceased, property that normally now be passed on to the heirs. As an example, you could take the well-documented case of a well-known character, very connected to Dante, Farinata degli Uberti. Dead in 1264, he was condemned as a heretic in 1283, 19 years after. Children and grandchildren saw themselves thrown out on the street, in the literal sense of the term, given that beyond the confiscation of goods, the houses were destroyed. And protests were to no avail, because according to Inquisition law, a crime as horrendous as heresy was punished not only in the living, but also in the dead, and also in the heirs. Such a practice served, therefore, only to enrich the inquisitors and the Holy See. In fact, strangely enough, right in the period in which posthumous condemnations became frequent, papal provisions imposed on the inquisitors to pay the cash balances every year to the Apostolic Camera, that is to say, the treasury of the Holy See, which later on, as has been said, claims half of the receipts. Michel Roquebert writes that when the last Occident Cathars were burned, those Italians disappeared for about a generation. Perhaps it's true that the Cathars had disappeared, but the trials and burnings did not end for this reason, but continued in, page 54, Italy for about another 100 years to the beginning of the 15th century. Farinata degli Uberti was definitely a Cathar, but his sons and grandsons were not. And the others? The many other rich and powerful families that had their goods expropriated with the excuse that the inquisitors believed an ancestor was a heretic. I would like to dwell for a moment to try my imagination as to how they lived back then. It was a climate of terror that the men of the church had created. A sword of Damocles loomed over like a dark and ever-present threat over all wealthy families. I think that Andrea del Coll was right when he concluded that this practice had struck the heretics and their families, the believers, the followers, and all the heirs to the second generation, including those who had remained Catholic. A major deterrent, almost equally serious as burning at the stake. There is another aspect that isn't usually placed into view. How much all this burdened the economy, how much it had destroyed and impeded the development of the region in which, more than elsewhere, the Cathars were present: southern France, northern Italy, Flanders, the Rhineland. That by no chance were the richest, most productive regions, more productive than just from the point of economics, but socially, culturally, and I would say also spiritually, of the world back then. The Cathars, as already said, were not paupers, and also the Consolati lived by their work, with a lifestyle very different from that of the Franciscans and the Dominicans that had been ordained beggars. But not because they were poor, they were very rich, but because they lived on donations, legacies, as well as goods taken from the heretics. They represented then a further category after politicians, soldiers, and priests that lived off the burden on the shoulders of the workers and impoverished society. In the Church of Holy Mary of Grace in Milan, that is, Dominican, today in the 21st century, one finds at the counter flyers entitled, "Do you know the Dominicans?" The text starts like this. Saint Dominic of Guzman was born in Calaruega, Spain in 1172. His vocation grew, encountering the poverty caused by the Cathar heresy in the south of France. Yes, you've read it right. Poverty caused by the Cathar heresy. History is written by the victors. The truth is another thing.